The gravel was still crunching under my tires when I saw her. 5:52 a.m. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and the neighbor's wood smoke, but the heat coming off Sandra was enough to melt the frost on my windshield. I hadn't even killed the ignition on my Bronco. I sat there, the engine idling in a low rhythmic thrum that shook the coffee in my cup holder, watching her storm across my lawn. She was in a lavender silk robe that caught the wind, her face twisted into something that looked less like a human and more like a gargoyle. She didn't knock, she pounded. Her knuckles hit my driver's side window with a hollow, violent thud, the sound of someone who had never been told no in 50 years of life. "Move this junk, Garrett," she screamed, her voice muffled but sharp enough to cut through the glass. "This isn't a trailer park. This is a gated community with standards." I didn't move. I didn't reach for the door handle. I just watched a single bead of sweat roll down her temple despite the morning chill. I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that turned cloying and sour as it drifted through my cracked vent. She pulled her phone out, her thumb hovering over the screen like a detonator. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling the HOA board. You'll be out of this house by noon." She was dialing 911. Not the non-emergency line for a parking complaint, but the line meant for blood and bullets. I watched her lips move, repeating my address, claiming there was a hostile squatter blocking her access. My access. My driveway. The L-shaped concrete pad my father had poured with his own hands 40 years ago. Sandra had moved in 6 months ago when Arthur, the HOA president, cleared out the undesirables on the east side. She thought she was the queen of Willow Ridge. She thought her Mercedes lease and her platinum highlights gave her the right to dictate where a man could park his own truck on his own land. What she didn't know was that while she was talking to dispatch, I was looking at the call sign on my dashboard. I knew the dispatcher, Sarah. I knew she'd be confused. I knew she was looking at the GPS tag for my personal vehicle. 5 minutes later, the blue and red strobes started bouncing off the white columns of Sandra's mansion. A patrol car rolled up, the tires whispering against the asphalt. Sandra stood there, a smug, ugly smile stretching her face, smoothing her robe as if she were about to receive an award. She didn't notice the way the officer, a 10-year veteran named Miller, didn't pull his hat low or reach for his ticket book. He stepped out, looked at her, then looked at me. "Morning, Chief," he said, his voice level and respectful. The silence that followed was so thick you could have choked on it. The color drained from Sandra's face so fast it turned a sickly, translucent gray. She looked like she was about to faint onto the wet grass. "Chief," she whispered, the word sounding like a curse in her mouth. "Yes, ma'am," I said, finally stepping out of the truck, the leather of my boots creaking as I stood to my full height. "You just called 911 on the chief of police for parking legally in the house he grew up in. And since you mentioned the HOA, I think it's time you and Arthur realize that your little kingdom doesn't sit above the law. Miller, get a statement. I want the recording of that 911 call preserved. We're going to talk about filing false reports and harassment before the sun is fully up." Inside my house, the air still smelled like my father's old pipe tobacco and floor wax, a comforting scent that Sandra's screeching had almost managed to stain. I sat at the heavy oak kitchen table, the morning light cutting through the dust motes in long, sharp blades, and opened a thick, weathered manila folder that Sandra didn't know existed. Over the next week, the harassment didn't stop. It morphed into something professional, something cold and calculated. Sandra had realized she couldn't outrank me, so she decided to bury me under the weight of the HOA's legal machinery. Every single afternoon, I'd come home to a new yellow notice taped to my front door with aggressive heavy-duty adhesive that left a residue like a scar on the wood. One day it was a fine for the discoloration of my driveway concrete, even though the oil stain was from my dad's old Ford back in 1998. The next day, it was a $200 penalty for having a non-approved bird feeder in my backyard, a small wooden house my niece had painted that was barely visible from the street. Sandra started taking photos of me through her second-story window. I could see the glint of her lens every time I walked to my mailbox, her silhouette standing perfectly still behind those expensive lace curtains. She was building a file, trying to prove that my presence was detrimental to the neighborhood's psychological well-being, a phrase Arthur, the HOA president, loved to use in his monthly newsletters. I started keeping my own log, a meticulous record of every time her heels clicked past my property line, every time her nephew accidentally blew his lawn clippings onto my porch, and every time a strange car would idle in front of my house for exactly 10 minutes before driving off. But the real shift happened on Thursday. I came home to find a surveyor in my yard, a man in a neon vest who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He told me the HOA had hired him to verify the encroachment of my garage. Sandra was standing on her porch, sipping something from a crystal glass, watching him work with a look of predatory hunger. She thought she'd found a loophole, a way to claim that 4 inches of my garage belonged to the association, which would give them the right to demand I tear it down. What she didn't realize was that I had the original 1965 blueprints and a certified county survey tucked away in my safe. She was spending HOA funds, money from all the neighbors, to fuel a personal vendetta, and that was the first thread I started to pull. I spent my nights at the precinct, not looking at criminal records, but at the county's property tax database and the HOA's public filings. I found that Arthur hadn't filed a proper audit in 3 years, and Sandra's mansion had been purchased through a shell company registered in Delaware. The more she pushed me, the more I dug into the foundation of their little empire. I found that 3 other families had been forced out in the last 2 years, their homes bought for pennies on the dollar by that same Delaware company. It wasn't just about my truck or my grass. It was a land grab, a systematic operation to devalue certain homes and flip them for a profit. Sandra wasn't just a Karen, she was the front woman for a racketeering scheme, and every time she taped a fine to my door, she was just handing me another piece of evidence for the grand jury. I sat there in the dark of my kitchen, the blue light of my laptop reflecting in my eyes, and I felt a grim satisfaction. She wanted to play neighbor from hell, but I was the one with the subpoena power. The following Monday, the war entered a phase of psychological warfare that would have broken anyone else, but for me, it was just more ink for the warrant. I pulled into Oakmont Drive at 4:15 p.m. to find my entire front lawn covered in bright orange flags, the kind utility companies use to mark gas lines, but there were hundreds of them, spaced exactly 6 inches apart in a perfect, mocking grid. Sandra was standing in her driveway, her arms crossed over a designer gym outfit, her face wearing a mask of feigned concern as she told me the HOA had received a report of an illegal underground irrigation system on my property and they were conducting a mandatory soil integrity test. It was a lie, a blatant attempt to make my house look like a construction zone to any potential buyer or visitor, and it was the first time she'd actually stepped onto my soil without a robe on. I didn't pull the flags. I didn't even acknowledge her presence. Instead, I walked to my porch and noticed my doorbell camera had been smeared with something thick and greasy, Vaseline. She was getting smarter, or so she thought, trying to blind the digital eyes that were recording her every move. But she didn't know about the secondary post system I'd hidden in the oak trees, cameras the size of a thumb that were currently capturing her nephew, a 19-year-old kid with a history of petty theft, trespassing into my backyard with a bag of salt. I watched the footage on my phone in real time as he systematically poured the salt in a circle around my prize-winning hydrangea bushes, a slow-acting poison that would kill the roots and turn the soil sterile for years. My pulse didn't even quicken. I just hit save and uploaded it to the cloud folder marked vandalism and criminal mischief. That night, the HOA president, Arthur, finally made his appearance. He knocked on my door at 9 p.m., wearing a suit that cost more than my first 2 cars combined, carrying a leather-bound folder. He didn't lead with threats, he led with concern. He told me the neighborhood was evolving, and that a man in my position, a chief of police with such a high-profile job, would probably be more comfortable in one of the new developments across town, the ones with better security and less history. He offered to have his company buy my house, cash, no inspections, for about 60% of its actual market value. It was a classic shakedown, delivered with a smile and a handshake that felt like a snake's skin. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I wasn't selling, not now, not ever. The smile didn't just fade, it vanished, revealing the cold, calculating predator underneath. He told me that Willow Ridge has a way of rejecting people who don't fit in, and as he walked away, I noticed the license plate on his black SUV. It was a government plate, one that shouldn't have been on a private vehicle. That was the missing piece. Arthur wasn't just the HOA president. He was a consultant for the county supervisor's office, using his political connections to fast-track permits and bury complaints against his shell companies. Sandra was his soldier, the one who did the dirty work of harassing people until they broke, but Arthur was the architect. I went back to my desk, the air in the house feeling heavy and stagnant, and started cross-referencing Arthur's government plate with the county's fuel logs. I found thousands of dollars in misappropriated funds, gas cards used for personal trips to his beach house, and maintenance records for his private fleet charged to the taxpayers. They thought they were a local dynasty, untouchable behind their white columns and gated entries, but they were just common thieves with better tailors. I spent the rest of the night drafting a request for a formal audit of the HOA's accounts, knowing that the moment it hit the board's desk, Sandra and Arthur would go into a panic. And a panicked Karen is a Karen who makes mistakes. Tuesday morning, the trap I'd set started closing, and Sandra responded exactly the way a cornered predator does, by fabricating a crime. I was in my kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee barely masking the metallic scent of the heavy rain that had pounded the roof all night, when 4 patrol cruisers screamed onto Oakmont Drive, their sirens wailing in a synchronized chaos that woke every house on the block. I didn't even have to look out the window to know they were here for me. I stepped onto the porch just as Deputy Chin, a man I'd shared a dozen meals with, approached me with a look of pure agony on his face, his hand hovering near his holster. Sandra was across the street, draped in a trench coat, her hair a mess in the wind, screaming at the top of her lungs that I had brandished a weapon at her through the fence. She was telling the officers, my officers, that I had threatened to end her because of the HOA fines, and she had a grainy, blurred photo on her phone of me holding a dark, metallic object in my backyard. It was a classic swatting attempt, a move designed to get me suspended or worse, removed in handcuffs in front of the entire neighborhood. I stood there, calm, my hands visible, watching the neighbors peek through their blinds, watching the fear and confusion ripple through the ranks of the men I led. Chin told me he had to follow protocol, that a report of an armed threat meant he had to search my person. I didn't resist. I let him pat me down, let him feel the empty pockets of my denim jacket, while Sandra shrieked in the background about police corruption and dangerous men with badges. Once he was done, I looked past him, straight into Sandra's eyes, and saw the flicker of doubt begin to replace her smugness. I told Chin to check the metallic object in the photo against the pile of garden tools near my shed. It was a pair of heavy-duty loppers I'd used to trim the hedge she'd complained about. But then I made my move. I told Chin, on the record, to look at the timestamp of her complaint and then look at the overhead 360-degree camera I'd installed on my chimney the night before. I had footage of her standing on a step stool, leaning over my fence with her own phone, and then, the smoking gun, footage of her and Arthur huddling together 5 minutes later, pointing at my house and laughing while he handed her a small, white envelope. It was the payout for the hit. Sandra's face didn't just turn white, it turned a ghastly, translucent blue. She started backpedaling, claiming she might have been mistaken about the gun, but the damage was done. Filing a false report of a violent felony isn't a mistake, you walk away from when the victim is the chief of police. I stayed on my porch, watching as Chin realized he had no choice but to take a statement from her under the warning of perjury. As the cruisers finally pulled away, leaving the street in an eerie, vibrating silence, I saw Arthur's black SUV peel out of his driveway, his tires smoking against the asphalt. He was running to cover his tracks, but he was too late. I went back inside and dialed the state prosecutor's office. I told them the Willow Ridge project was ready for a full-scale raid. I had the false report, I had the video of the payoff, and I had the fuel logs that tied Arthur to a decade of systematic fraud. The storm outside was just beginning, but the one I was bringing to their door was going to be a Category 5. Wednesday afternoon was the day the paperwork finally turned into a noose. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy with the threat of another downpour, as 3 unmarked black sedans from the state auditor's office pulled up to the curb, their tires splashing through the puddles Sandra had complained about just the day before. I was standing on my porch, a cold cup of black coffee in my hand, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion wreck. Arthur, the HOA president, came out of his colonial fortress in a panic, his silk tie loosened, his expensive loafers clicking frantically on the wet pavement as he tried to intercept the lead auditor. I saw Sandra peering through her blinds, her silhouette rigid and frozen, probably wondering why her anonymous tips to the city manager hadn't stopped the bleeding. The auditors didn't ask for permission. They had a court order signed by a superior court judge that authorized the immediate seizure of all HOA financial records, including the digital servers housed in Arthur's home office. As the boxes of files began to pile up on the sidewalk, hundreds of folders containing the life savings and maintenance fees of every family on Oakmont Drive, the air felt like it was charged with static electricity. I walked down my driveway, the leather of my boots squeaking on the damp concrete, and stood at the edge of my property line just watching. Arthur caught my eye, and for the first time in 6 months, the mask of the sophisticated politician cracked. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin sallow, and I could see the tremor in his hands as he realized the Delaware shell company I'd found was just the tip of the iceberg. The auditors had discovered that Arthur and Sandra hadn't just been flipping houses. They had been embezzling the HOA's emergency reserve fund to pay for Sandra's Mercedes lease and Arthur's gambling debts in Atlantic City. Every fine they had slapped on me, every soil test they had conducted, and every noise violation, they had fabricated was an attempt to keep me busy so I wouldn't notice the missing millions. Sandra finally broke. She came running out onto her lawn, screaming about private property and illegal searches, her voice cracking into a desperate, jagged sound that carried across the entire block. She pointed a trembling finger at me, accusing me of orchestrating a coup and using my badge to settle a neighbor's grudge. I didn't say a word. I just pulled out my phone and played the audio I'd captured from my hidden yard mic 2 nights ago, the sound of her and Arthur discussing how to dispose of the secondary ledger before the state arrived. Her scream died in her throat, replaced by a wet, gasping sound as she realized the man she had been bullying for 6 months had been the one holding the keys to her prison cell the entire time. By 5 p.m., the auditors had enough evidence of wire fraud and racketeering to call in the FBI. The luxury lifestyle of Willow Ridge was exposed for what it was, a high-stakes Ponzi scheme run by 2 people who thought they were too smart for the rules. I watched the first of many yellow crime scene tapes being stretched across the entrance to the HOA clubhouse, the very place where Sandra used to hold her compliance meetings. The power had shifted so completely that even the birds seemed to stop chirping. I went back inside, sat at my father's table, and added the day's events to the final chapter of my binder. The neighborhood was quiet now, a heavy, expectant silence that felt like the calm before a hurricane. Thursday night was when the last remnants of Sandra's sanity finally dissolved into the humid, midnight air. I was sitting in my darkened living room, the only light coming from the glowing grid of my security monitors, when the motion sensors on the perimeter of my backyard flared to life. On the screen, I saw a ghostly infrared silhouette crawling through the tall grass near my property line. It was Sandra, stripped of her silk robes and designer jewelry, dressed in all-black athletic gear that looked ridiculous on her rigid frame. She was carrying a heavy plastic jug and a long-handled lighter, her movements jerky and desperate as she approached the side of my garage where I kept my father's old workbench and a collection of vintage oil cans. She wasn't just trying to find me anymore, she was trying to burn the evidence of my existence away. I watched her through the lens of a 4K hidden camera as she unscrewed the cap, the smell of gasoline likely filling her nose, her hands shaking so violently she splashed the liquid onto her own sneakers. She was whispering to herself, a frantic rhythmic mumble that the high-gain microphone picked up as a litany of curses against the man who ruined everything. She thought the darkness was her ally, but I had the entire yard bathed in invisible infrared light, turning her secret mission into a high-definition horror movie. Just as she flicked the lighter, the small flame illuminating her hollowed-out eyes and the sweat dripping from her brow, I stepped out onto the back porch and hit the master switch for the stadium-grade floodlights I'd installed the day before. The yard exploded into a blinding, artificial noon, catching her frozen like a deer in the headlights, the lighter still sparking in her hand. "Drop it, Sandra," I said, my voice projected through the external PA system, booming off the walls of her own house like the voice of an angry god. She screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror, and scrambled backward, slipping on the very gasoline she just poured onto my grass. I didn't move toward her. I just stood there, my silhouette framed by the porch light, watching as the weight of her choices finally crushed her. Within seconds, the silent alarm I'd triggered brought 3 patrol units screaming into the cul-de-sac, their tires barking against the asphalt. Sandra didn't even try to run this time. She just slumped onto the wet ground, sobbing into her gasoline-soaked hands as the officers moved in to cuff her for attempted arson and criminal trespassing. Across the fence, I saw Arthur's second-story light go out. He was watching, realizing that his loyal soldier had just handed me the final nail for his own coffin. As they loaded Sandra into the back of a cruiser, her screams fading into a pathetic whimper, I looked at the scorched patch of grass where she tried to start the fire. It was a small scar, one that would heal, but the stain on her life was now permanent. I went back inside, checked the backup servers to ensure the footage was already synced to the DA's office, and finally felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The Karen of Willow Ridge was gone, replaced by a broken woman in a jumpsuit, and Arthur was now standing alone in a house built on a foundation of stolen dreams and forged signatures. Friday morning arrived with a silence so heavy it felt like the entire county was holding its breath, waiting for the final hammer to fall on the house of cards Arthur had built. At exactly 9 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs and state police cruisers rounded the corner of Oakmont Drive, not with sirens blaring this time, but with a quiet, lethal precision that signaled the end of the game. I stood on my porch, the morning sun glinting off the badge I'd pinned back onto my uniform for the first time in weeks, watching as a dozen agents and windbreakers marked FBI and state police swarmed the HOA clubhouse and Arthur's front lawn. Arthur tried to make one last stand, appearing at his front door in a tailored charcoal suit, clutching a gold-tipped pen as if he could sign his way out of a federal indictment, but the lead agent didn't even stop to talk. He simply handed Arthur a search warrant that authorized the seizure of every computer, every ledger, and every filing cabinet within the Colonial's walls. The neighbors, the same people Sandra and Arthur had spent years intimidating with fines and false reports, finally stepped out of their houses, lining the sidewalks in a silent, powerful vigil as the contents of the HOA's black box were hauled out in cardboard boxes. I watched as they dragged out the primary server, the one Sandra had died 1,000 deaths trying to protect, and I knew that within its hard drive were the records of every kickback, every laundered dollar, and every forged signature that had kept Willow Ridge under their thumb. Arthur's face went from a mask of defiance to a hollow gray shell of a man as the handcuffs finally clicked shut around his wrists, the sound sharp and final in the crisp morning air. He looked toward my house, his eyes searching for some flicker of mercy or perhaps just a sign of the man he thought he could break, but I gave him nothing but a level gaze as I adjusted my belt. Behind him, agents were already putting the federal seizure stickers on his Mercedes and his marble fountain, reclaiming the assets he'd stolen from the very people now watching his downfall. As the convoy began to pull away, carrying the HOA president and his decade of secrets toward a holding cell, the atmosphere on the street shifted from fear to a strange, collective relief. The compliance era was over, and the man who had orchestrated the misery of dozens of families was leaving in the back of a Ford, not the front of a luxury sedan. I walked down to the edge of the street, watching the taillights fade, and felt the weight of my father's house finally settle back into its rightful place. A home, not a battlefield. The HOA was dissolved, the leaders were in chains, and for the first time in 40 years Oakmont Drive belonged to the people who actually lived there. By Saturday morning, the air on Oakmont Drive felt different. It was lighter, stripped of the oppressive tension that had hung over the neighborhood like a toxic fog for years. I stood on my sidewalk, hands deep in my pockets, watching the aftermath of a fallen empire as a fleet of white vans from the state's victim restitution unit pulled up to the HOA clubhouse. The neighbors, people I'd only seen as fleeting shadows behind closed blinds for months, were finally coming out into the sun, gathering in small groups on their front lawns to talk without the fear of a nuisance fine hanging over their heads. Mrs. Delacroix, whose dog had nearly died from Sandra's poisoned yard, walked over to me with a plate of warm cornbread, her eyes bright with a mix of tears and pure, unadulterated triumph. She told me how Sandra had threatened to report her for mental instability to the state just to seize her house for Arthur's shell company, a story that was being repeated in different versions all down the block. I listened as Gary from across the street confessed he'd been paying double HOA dues for 2 years because Arthur had convinced him his roof was out of code, money that had gone straight into Arthur's offshore accounts. It wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a crime scene turned into a town hall, as people realized that every small act of bullying they'd suffered was part of a larger, systemic heist. We stood there as the local news crews arrived, their cameras capturing the crime scene, tape fluttering in the breeze against the backdrop of Sandra's pristine, silent mansion. The Karen of Willow Ridge was already a lead story on the morning news, her mugshot, wild-eyed and gasoline-stained, flashing on every screen in the county. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the headlines. It was in the sight of a young family from 3 streets over, people who had been on the verge of eviction due to fabricated HOA liens, weeping with relief as an agent explained that their debt was being frozen and investigated as part of the racketeering case. I looked at the orange flags still dotting my lawn, the ridiculous grid Sandra had built to humiliate me, and I realized they didn't look like threats anymore. They looked like markers of a battle won. The community started a spontaneous cleanup, neighbors helping each other pull up the flags, rake the dead hydrangeas, and scrub the Vaseline off the cameras, turning the destruction into a celebration of shared resilience. I was no longer just the intruder with the loud truck, or the dangerous chief of police. I was the neighbor who had stood his ground when everyone else was forced to kneel. As the sun hit its peak, the neighborhood held its first ever non-sanctioned block party, a quiet but defiant gathering where the only rule was that there were no rules, and for the first time since my father's funeral, I felt the true warmth of the house he had built for me. The courtroom was as cold as the heart of the woman sitting at the defense table, a stark, sterile room that smelled of floor polish and the heavy, suffocating weight of the law. I sat in the front row, my uniform pressed and my badge catching the dim fluorescent light, watching Sandra as she sat without her silk robes or her platinum blonde confidence. She looked small, her skin sallow and her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal's, while Arthur sat next to her, his $3,000 suit now looking like a cheap costume against the backdrop of federal indictments. The prosecutor didn't just present evidence. He unleashed a mountain of it, a systematic dismantling of their lives that began with the recording of that first 911 call. When the audio played, Sandra's shrill, panicked voice lying about a hostile intruder, while my engine idled peacefully, the jury's faces hardened into masks of pure disgust. Then came the financial forensics. The 847 pages of documentation I'd helped compile, detailing every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every secret wire transfer to that Delaware shell company. The Karen of Willow Ridge tried to play the victim one last time, taking the stand to claim that she was only protecting the community's integrity, but her voice cracked when the prosecutor showed the high-definition footage of her crawling through my backyard with a gasoline jug and a lighter. The silence in the room after that video played was deafening, a vacuum of sound that sucked the air out of her lungs. Arthur's defense team tried to argue that he was unaware of the extent of the harassment, but the thousands of dollars in fuel logs and the recorded conversations from my hidden mics painted a picture of a man who was the puppet master of a suburban nightmare. The judge didn't show an ounce of mercy. She spoke about the sanctity of the home and the vile abuse of power that turns neighbors into enemies. Sandra was sentenced to 7 years for attempted arson, perjury, and conspiracy, her screams echoing through the hall as they led her away in shackles, a far cry from the clicking of her heels on my driveway. Arthur received 15 years for federal wire fraud and racketeering, his assets seized, his colonial mansion slated for a public auction to pay back the families he had bled dry. As I walked out of that courthouse and into the bright, honest sunlight, I felt the final chapter of my father's story close with a satisfying, heavy thud. The law hadn't just worked, it had reclaimed a piece of the world that people like Sandra thought they could buy and bully.